Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about mid-round draft targets for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're talking about 5 players in specific, beginning with Rhamondre Stevenson, then Jalen Hurts, Juju Smith-Schuster, Elijah Moore, and to close it out, Brandon Aiyuk. All players that can be found in the middle rounds of your upcoming 2022 fantasy football drafts, and players that I think we need to take a deeper dive, a deeper look into in order to share my perspective, share some stats in order to convince you as to why I'm targeting them and why you should be going into your 2022 fantasy football drafts. Now, speaking of drafts, before we begin, for those of you who haven't checked out Underdog Fantasy yet, be sure to do so today. If you go ahead, travel to Underdog Fantasy using the link down in the description and sign up and make a first-time deposit using promo code Andrew, you'll not only get a deposit match up to $100, but you'll also get my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings. So to give you a little bit more context, my rankings consist of half and full PPR by position tiered rankings at the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, and defensive positions, along with my top 200 flex rankings. I will go ahead and personally send you that email about 24 hours after you've signed up, sometimes earlier if I'm able to get the up-to-date email list and send it out in your guys' direction. Now, that's not where it ends. Besides getting the initial rankings sent in your direction, I will be sending you up-to-date rankings once per week for the entirety of the month of August up until the first week of the fantasy football season to ensure that you are prepared regardless of when you're drafting, so you can build a fantastic fantasy football team to help yourself win a 2022 championship. Now, besides my rankings, when you go ahead and make that first-time deposit via Underdog Fantasy today, you can go ahead and draft via the Pomeranian. It's another one of these drafts. It's a $3 entry. I've gone ahead and posted one of the graphics for it. It's a $3 entry. It's a giant best ball tournament. You can go ahead and put your skills to the test today by going to Underdog Fantasy and signing up for a couple of these drafts. Get those under your belt. Get some more experience so that regardless of where you're picking, you can go ahead and find success in 2022. So go ahead and check that out today. Promo code Andrew. The link is down in the description. Thank you very much. Final thing I wanted to mention before we begin. Again, subscribe to the channel. If you have not already, we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season, whether it is strength of schedule, updated rankings, and much more this offseason. When we get into the season, daily fantasy videos via rankings, waiver wire, Sunday morning live streams, must-start players, all of that coming in your direction. So if you want an advantage on your league, trying to win a 2022 fantasy football championship, be sure to subscribe. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into today's content, beginning with Rhamondre Stevenson as our first mid-round draft target. Again, currently, Rhamondre Stevenson is in a bit of a tricky situation because last year, in a half PPR scoring format, Damien Harris, the running back that is still with the organization, was the number 13 overall fantasy running back. Damien Harris had a season where it was a matter of right place at the right time. I mean, with only 202 total rushing attempts, that man scored 15 rushing touchdowns last year. That was second amongst all running backs last season. On top of it, again, with Sony Michel being traded during the 2021 preseason and Cam Newton being cut, that opened up so much more rushing opportunity. And why that's important is because the New England Patriots since 2017 have been the number 1 overall team in the National Football League in terms of running back opportunities. Running back opportunities meaning rushing attempts and targets combined. They were the number 4 overall team over the last 5 years in running back rushing attempts. As a whole, the organization has been built around running the ball on a consistent level. In fact, they've always been top 12 yearly in those two categories. The only time they haven't in the last 5 seasons was in 2020 when Cam Newton was the quarterback. He personally had 137 rushing attempts, 500 plus rushing yards, and 12 rushing touchdowns, which skewed some of the stats in his favor. But nonetheless, they got back on track last year, and they should be able to contain that consistency in 2022. Now, while we're still on the topic of Damien Harris, I am of the opinion that he's going to maintain his starting role. I have seen nothing this offseason that gives me the indication from the coaching staff or from training camp, any of that sense, that Rhamondre Stevenson has somehow taken the starting spot. Yet, I do believe that Rhamondre Stevenson has a very good opportunity of being a top 24 running back. So let's pinpoint exactly what I'm talking about. Number 1, James White the other day retired. Obviously, he had himself an incredible career. That hip injury that he sustained last season, brutal. Wasn't able to return to form. He went ahead, and as running backs do, retired early. It is what it is. Brandon Bolden, the guy who filled in for James White last season after he sustained that injury, consisted of 49 targets, 41 receptions, 405 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns in 2021. he is gone. He's with the Las Vegas Raiders. And the primary reason why I wanted to point this out was because Rhamondre Stevenson is going to be adopting majority of the receiving work in this backfield. Sure, Damien Harris will be able to catch 1 or 2 passes every week if he's lucky, but the primary receiving back of this offense going forward is Rhamondre Stevenson. And the way that I look at Stevenson is basically as a budget A.J. Dillon. A.J. Dillon is a little bit more expensive right now considering the hype around that offense without Devontae Adams. I look at Rhamondre Stevenson as a cheaper version in terms of overall ADP that could very easily surpass the value of A.J. Dillon in 2022. Rhamondre Stevenson had 133 rushing attempts last year. If you're able to elevate that number to 180, which he should very easily be able to accomplish considering there is no James White, there is no Brandon Bolden, J.J. Taylor hasn't looked good in training camp. I know they brought in 2 rookie running backs, but then again, you go back to a couple years ago when Bill Belichick drafted 2 rookie tight ends. What happened with them? A year later, they went out and they signed Juju Smith and Hunter Henry. The drafting of offensive threats and playmakers for this offense hasn't been up to scale in the last couple years. N'Keal Harry, Sony Michel, some of these guys just really haven't developed into the players that they thought they would be. Like I was saying, 180 rushing attempts should be easy to accomplish, mainly because when you look at Damien Harris's overall production last season, from weeks 6 through 18, Damien Harris was the number 7 overall fantasy running back, putting up 16 plus fantasy points per week and a half PPR throughout that 10-game span. Yet, he was still only playing 41.12% of the offensive snaps. So this offense is going to have a 2-headed monster. And of course, Rhamondre Stevenson should be able to attain that total rushing attempt amount. And then we add on a potential of 40 plus receptions in 2022. And we continue to creep closer to that top 24 standing. I'll tell you why. Since 2019, there have been 36 running backs in the National Football League who have totaled 150 rushing attempts and 40 receptions in a single season. 36 in the last 3 years. 34 of those 36 running backs were able to surpass a minimum of 159 total fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. Only 2 running backs, like I mentioned, did not surpass that overall fantasy point total. One being Saquon Barkley from last year, obviously dealt with an injury, hyper inefficient, and Myles Gaskin, who, he had himself 40 receptions and 240 receiving yards. The lack of efficiency from the rushing attack and receiving threat of Myles Gaskin was obviously apparent. I don't think Rhamondre Stevenson is going to be in that conversation based on what he's already been able to show last year in his rookie campaign. Now, just to put it in perspective, 159 fantasy points in the last 3 years. In 2019 would have been the number 23 overall back. In 2020 would have been the number 21 overall running back. And in 2021, 159 fantasy points would have equated to the number 24 overall running back, which was A.J. Dillon. Again, a budget A.J. Dillon is what I'm expecting to see out of Rhamondre Stevenson this year, which again is a potential mid-round target for your upcoming fantasy football drafts. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, Andrew, you've already said that you don't expect Damien Harris to go anywhere, yet you expect Rhamondre Stevenson to still be a potential top 24 back in terms of upside. I certainly do, and I'll tell you why. The New England Patriots have not been shy of giving their running backs opportunities. When we look at 2021, they gave their running backs the 6th most total rushing attempts. They gave their running backs the 7th most overall opportunities. When you're in the top 12 of that category, it bodes well in terms of being able to support 2 top 24 running backs. Let's look at the history of that. Last year, there were 2 teams that were able to get 2 top 24 backs, Denver and Green Bay. Both those teams had an opportunity rank of 10 or better. So they were in the top 10 of that category. In fact, when we go even back to 2018, there have been 9 total teams that have been able to accomplish this, allowing 2 of their running backs to be top 24 fantasy prospects. 8 of those 9 teams were able to get into the top 10 of that opportunity category, which again, the New England Patriots have easily been able to accomplish behind an incredible offensive line. We're talking about Isaiah Wynn, Trent Brown, Michael Onwenu, David Andrews. I know they traded Shaq Mason to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Hopefully Isaiah Wynn can get healthy before the season begins, but we're talking about still one of the better offensive lines. They drafted a first-round offensive lineman for a reason. They're going to continue to build. They're going to continue to run the ball. And I expect Rhamondre Stevenson to have a lot of upside this upcoming season. All right, let's go ahead and move on to Jalen Hurts, quarterback of the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, I have a long conversation about Jalen Hurts here, so buckle in. Here we go. Jalen Hurts has been one of the best quarterbacks since being given the starting job for the Philadelphia Eagles offense. In fact, when we look at the last 18 starts in his career, he has averaged 21.55 fantasy points per game. Over the course of those 18 games, he's been able to accumulate 177 rushing attempts for a total of 1,022 rushing yards and 11 rushing touchdowns. Again, that's only in 18 games. Now, to put it in perspective, that's 9.34 fantasy points per game from his rushing stats alone, not even counting his ability to throw the ball. Now, if you go ahead and you take his averages over the last 18 starts, we could potentially end up seeing in a 17-game season here 900 plus rushing yards and 10 plus rushing touchdowns, which again is an additional 150 plus fantasy points going into the 2022 season. So that not even including his potential passing threat, which we'll talk about in just a bit. But when we go into more detail regarding the 2021 season and the success that Jalen Hurts found, I wanted to mention a couple things. Prior to his ankle injury that he sustained in Week 12 against the New York Giants, that of course made him miss a couple games and slowed him down at the back end of the season. In the first 11 games of the season, weeks 1 through 11, he was the number 1 overall ranked quarterback in fantasy football in terms of fantasy points scored, averaging 22.55 fantasy points per game. If you went ahead and took his full stats from weeks 1 through 11 and coursed them over a full 17-game season, he was on pace to being the number 2 overall ranked quarterback in fantasy football with 383 plus points in a 4-point per passing touchdown format. He would have ended up with 3,500 passing yards, 20 passing touchdowns, 955 rushing yards, 12 rushing touchdowns, 8 interceptions. Again, from weeks 1 through 11, in 10 of those performances, he was a top 12 fantasy quarterback in those given weeks. And one of the main reasons he was able to accomplish this was because of his rushing threat, but not just the yardage he got, but the rushing touchdowns. One of the most important stats for a quarterback isn't just passing touchdowns, it's the rushing touchdowns. Because as we know, it's that much more valuable. 2 extra points per rushing touchdown in comparison to a passing touchdown just seems like Jalen Hurts has the edge over these pocket passers. Now let's talk about this. Last season, he had 31 red zone rushing attempts. That was 20th amongst all players in the National Football League last year. He had 13 rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line, which ranked 6th amongst all players. I mean, that's comparing against running backs like Jonathan Taylor, Joe Mixon, etc. But of those 13 attempts that he had from inside the 5-yard line, he was able to score 7 rushing touchdowns. Like we mentioned with Miles Sanders a couple days ago, a lot of those touchdowns were stolen via QB sneak. 5 touchdowns last year on the goal line, QB sneaks, while a couple other of them were read options and or scrambles that found Jalen Hurts in the end zone. Nonetheless, a lot of opportunity was available, which elevated the Eagles offense to being one of the most threatening rushing attacks in the National Football League last year. In 2021, the Philadelphia Eagles had the second most team rushing attempts, only behind the Tennessee Titans by 1 attempt. They had the most rushing yards, most rushing touchdowns, and they were number 4 amongst all teams in yards per attempt. They were averaging 4.9. On the other end of the spectrum, unfortunately, they had the fewest passing attempts amongst all teams in the National Football League. When I went ahead and looked at the weapons that Jalen Hurts had last year, of course, we have Devonta Smith. They also had Dallas Goedert. It's important to mention that Dallas Goedert was significantly better after the trade of Zach Ertz to the Arizona Cardinals. But either way, Devonta Smith, 916 receiving yards, an okay season. Dallas Goedert, 830 receiving yards. The Philadelphia Eagles were one of 10 teams last year that didn't have a single 1,000-yard receiving option on their team. And now you go ahead and you add A.J. Brown, who we've heard all offseason is best friends with Jalen Hurts. Their families are hanging out together. Everything is continuing to build in terms of their relationship going into 2022 and their potential upside. But what both Jalen Hurts and A.J. Brown have in common is that their strength of schedules going into 2022 is one of the easiest ones in the National Football League. In fact, the Philadelphia Eagles quarterback position has the 4th easiest strength of schedule going into 2022, as I've calculated that. I will have a couple videos coming out later this summer to give you some understanding as to how I found those totals. Be sure to subscribe for more content. So they have the 4th easiest strength of schedule. I mean, you just go look at their schedule right now. Look at the first 7 games, okay? They play against Detroit, Minnesota, Washington, Jacksonville, Arizona, and Dallas. Those are very easy games. Then they get a week 7 bye. So first 6 games of the season, boom, you hit a bye week. Last year, their bye week was in week 14. Of course, you were going to find injuries eventually by then. I mean, they went 12 weeks and then the ankle got busted for Jalen Hurts. I mean, you go ahead, you have an earlier bye week here. obviously there is less potential for injury because you have that resting period there. You're not able to get back to 100%, but at least you get back to 75% and then you continue to roll through teams. But not only that, the Philadelphia Eagles wide receiver core this season has the easiest strength of schedule amongst all teams in the National Football League. There's a lot of potential for A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith this year, which is only going to help elevate the overall production of Jalen Hurts on a weekly basis. Now, speaking of his overall production, a lot of that has been predicated on how well this offensive line has played. Whether it's rushing or whether it's pass blocking, they are, in my opinion, the best offensive line in the National Football League. Hands down. 2 all-pro tackles. You have one of the best centers in the National Football League. I know Jason Kelce's in his last year. You have 2 offensive guards that are not only just average, but they're better than average. In terms of PFF grades across the board, we have a top-tier offensive line. They even went ahead and they drafted Jason Kelce's protege, the future of this offensive line. They're still building, yet they still have one of the most dominant rushing attacks in the National Football League. Because of this rushing attack, it's allowed Jalen Hurts to sit back and play action situations and be able to dice up defenses. Last season, on a normal passing attempt, Jalen Hurts had a 61% passing completion percentage. During play action plays last season, in the 138 attempts, he completed 95 of those, which was a 68.8% passing completion percentage for 1,280 passing yards and 7 passing touchdowns. Again, when you're able to elevate your passing completion percentage by upwards of 7%, just because it's play action, because of how dominant this offensive line has been, just leads me to believe that Jalen Hurts is going to continue to improve going into 2022. Again, this is the second season with Nick Sirianni. That playbook is going to be that much more in-depth and nuanced for the advantages that the Philadelphia Eagles offense presents on a weekly basis. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the first wide receiver of today's episode, Juju Smith-Schuster. And though I don't have him in Kansas City Chiefs gear, that is correct. He is going to be a part of the Kansas City Chiefs. He's got pretty big shoes to fill, but we'll talk about that. Now, one of the interesting things that came to mind prior to making this video was the fact that when you go back to the 2021 offseason, the Kansas City Chiefs were one of the teams that offered Juju Smith-Schuster a contract, and he, didn't want to take that deal, so he went back to the Pittsburgh Steelers on a 1-year deal in order to try to reset the wide receiver market, come out and have incredible stats. Obviously, we remember he had a season-ending shoulder injury. He did come back for the playoffs, but really wasn't much there. He goes ahead into 2022. He hits the open market, and the Kansas City Chiefs are still interested in his services because they know they are in need of a slot wide receiver. And I'll get into more details regarding that, but let's talk about what Juju Smith-Schuster has accomplished in his career and why I think we should be targeting him going into 2022. Now, over his career, when he has had Big Ben under center and he's played a full healthy season, when we go back to 2018, Juju Smith-Schuster was the number 9 overall ranked wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format, putting up 241 fantasy points. You go to 2020, when Ben Roethlisberger full healthy and so was Juju Smith, he was number 18 overall ranked wide receiver in fantasy football with 185.6 fantasy points. As long as he has had his quarterback healthy and he's been able to play a full year, of course, he's been a fantastic fantasy prospect for us. So why not add him into a Kansas City Chiefs offense who no longer has Tyreek Hill, has one of the best, if not the best quarterback in the National Football League in Patrick Mahomes, and just see Juju Smith's skill elevate and his production continue to flow in on a weekly basis. Now, in Juju's time with the Pittsburgh Steelers, of course, when given opportunity, he found success. Anytime he was given 8 or more targets, 14.87 fantasy points per game. That was 21 of the 32 games in between the years of 2018 and 2020 with Ben Roethlisberger under center. Not only that, in terms of the kind of receiver he has been in the past, yards after the catch has always been something that has come easy to Juju Smith-Schuster. The fact that in 2018, he was number 1 amongst all receiving options with 660 yak, while in 2020, he was number 13 amongst all wide receivers with 404. Now again, you add him into the Kansas City Chiefs offense, who no longer has Tyreek Hill. And you're thinking to yourself, Andrew, Tyreek Hill's a speedster. He's always going for those, deep routes. How is Juju Smith-Schuster going to fill his role? Well, over the years, Tyreek Hill has progressed and gotten himself into the slot position as his primary role. I mean, we look at the last, 3 full healthy seasons of Tyreek Hill. 47, 46, and 60. Those are the amount of receptions in the last 3 years that we have seen in individual seasons from the slot position. When he's lined up in the slot, how many total receptions he was able to earn per year. Those are incredible stats. And they continue to use him in the slot position because he continued to find advantageous matchups on a weekly basis. Now, the slot position for Juju Smith-Schuster is where he's thrived the most in his career. You go back to 2018, he had 62 receptions from the slot on 92 targets. In 2018, he had the most slot targets in the entire National Football League. You go to 2020. Also, again, had the most targets in the slot position with 103 that led to 81 receptions, 700 plus yards, and 9 receiving touchdowns. Juju Smith-Schuster is a perfect slot receiver for this offense, and that's why even after he declined his contract for the 2021 year, they went out and they reoffered again because they know he can instantly make an impact in this offense. Now, when we look at the threats that are no longer going to be with the Kansas City Chiefs, besides Tyreek Hill, we have Byron Pringle gone. We have Demarcus Robinson gone, Josh Gordon gone, and Kemp gone. They all accounted for 163 total targets from the slot position that led to 121 receptions, 1,440 receiving yards, and 9 receiving touchdowns. Now, when you take into account that Patrick Mahomes targeted the wide receiver position 367 times last year, those amount of targets accounted for 44.4% of the total targets for the wide receiver position. So obviously, Patrick Mahomes wants to target his slot receiver, which in this case is going to be Juju Smith-Schuster. Now, for those of you who are wondering, is Patrick Mahomes going to be the same without Tyreek Hill? I can assure you he will be. In the last 4 seasons, in the 6 games that Patrick Mahomes has played without Tyreek Hill in the lineup, or Tyreek Hill leaving early in the first quarter because of an injury, these are the stats that Patrick Mahomes has put forth. In those 6 games, he's averaged 326 passing yards per game, 2 passing touchdowns per game, 0.14 interceptions per game, 27.7 rushing yards, and 23.5 fantasy points per game. Again, a lot of production regardless of the fact that Tyreek Hill is there or not. Now, a lot of people look at Patrick Mahomes' 2021 season and think, man, he was so inconsistent. How can we trust him this year? Is he really going to be the same? I mean, let's just put it in perspective. I know a lot of people were complaining about Patrick Mahomes all last season. It was in my comment section every single week. But Patrick Mahomes' off year of 4,800 passing yards and 37 passing touchdowns, it may be the worst season that Patrick Mahomes has had, but for other quarterbacks, this would be their MVP year. I know the Kansas City Chiefs brought in Marquez Valdes-Scantling to be a receiving threat. He's not going to play in the slot. He's going to play on the outside. He'll, of course, be competing for those deep threat targets and pulling a lot of coverage in those cover 2 scenarios. They also lost Darrell Williams. That's a backfield threat. They're going to go ahead and fill in those targets with a respective running back. They bring in Sky Moore, another one of these rookies. Is he going to find immediate success? Only time will tell, but I 100% believe Juju's being undervalued and should be a mid-round target in 2022. Moving on, let's talk about Elijah Moore, another second-year player that, in my opinion, has a lot of potential for success. Again, in yesterday's video, we talked about Garrett Wilson and his opportunity to immediately step into the Jets offense and find opportunities because of how often they throw the ball, because of how many negative game scripts they saw. Now, before we get into those negative game scripts, let's talk about what Elijah Moore has done in the past. Obviously, last year, he didn't really find much success early on in the season. This is a former Ole Miss wide receiver. Other Ole Miss wide receivers that we've mentioned in the past, DK Metcalf, AJ Brown. There's a lineage of success that we've seen there as of late that hopefully Elijah Moore can continue on. Last season, after the Week 6 bye, Elijah Moore finally found his footing and really got to being exactly what the New York Jets were looking to draft, which is a stud number 1 wide receiver. From week 7 through 13, prior to the injury that ended his season, Elijah Moore was the number 4 overall ranked wide receiver in half PPR scoring formats, averaging 15.16 fantasy points per game throughout a 7-game span, only behind Cooper Kupp, Justin Jefferson, and Deebo Samuel. Again, he was playing at an elite level, only averaging 8.14 targets per game, 5 catches, 67 yards, but was averaging 0.86 touchdowns per game. And as Elijah Moore continued to produce, he continued to see more opportunity on the field. In the final 3 games of his rookie season, he was playing 80+% of the offensive snaps. You keep him on the field, of course, more opportunity is going to go in his direction. And the reason why there is so much passing opportunity in this Jets offense was mainly because they were awful. Offensively, defensively, they couldn't find much success. Again, like I mentioned yesterday with Garrett Wilson, the New York Jets last season in 17 contests were outscored 310 to 504. That's a ridiculous number to take into account in terms of the amount of times that they had to pass due to those negative game scripts. The quarterback passing attempts throughout 17 weeks was 602 passing attempts, while their running back rushing attempts totaled to 326. That is a 65% passing rate by the quarterback position, which in 2022 seemed like it could very easily be duplicated. Now, Zach Wilson, luckily, is not going to have a season-ending injury. It's going to take 1 to 2 weeks to get him back. Whether it is him starting or Joe Flacco, it doesn't really make a difference to me. He's going to throw the ball as much as he possibly can. And even though he's not the most accurate quarterback, it honestly does not matter to me. As long as we are getting targets in the direction of Elijah Moore, in my opinion, he's talented enough to make the most of those opportunities. Last season, in the 2 games that he played with Zach Wilson under center, he averaged 12.45 fantasy points per game. He scored 1 touchdown in those 2 games, accumulated over 100 receiving yards on 5 catches and 10 targets. The opportunity wasn't at an elite level, but hopefully, Zach Wilson has learned a thing or two this offseason and is going to get the ball to his number 1 wide receiver. Moving on to our final mid-round draft target for the 2022 fantasy football season, I present to you Brandon Aiyuk of the San Francisco 49ers. Now, I know I may have triggered some of you because Brandon Aiyuk last season had all the hype. I mean, it wasn't by accident. You go back to 2020, Brandon Aiyuk from week 7 through 16 was averaging 15.15 fantasy points per game in a 7-game span. Throughout that span of time, he was the number 6 overall wide receiver in fantasy points per game. He was incredible in 2020. And with the history of Deebo Samuel's injuries in 2019 and 2020, missing 10 games, of course we thought, Brandon Aiyuk should be able to step up and be the number 1 receiving option in this offense. Little did we all know that Brandon Aiyuk was in the doghouse and Deebo Samuel was going to have one of the most historic seasons in NFL history, breaking records in terms of wide receiver rushing touchdowns, total yardage, all this kind of stuff. I mean, an insane year that a lot of us didn't see coming. But despite all of that, Brandon Aiyuk still managed to be, a top 36 wide receiver, though he was literally the number 36 wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format. For many of us, it was a giant miss because we spent very high draft capital on him. He was ranked, as wide receiver 16 through 22 in majority of the drafts that I ended up seeing him coming off the board. I mean, that's where I had him ranked for majority of last offseason. And obviously that burnt many of us, but let's just put into perspective the kind of year that Brandon Aiyuk had. Starting week 1, he was in the doghouse, only played like 20% of the offensive snaps. Obviously, Kyle Shanahan wasn't vibing with him. Throughout the first 8 weeks of the season, he wasn't vibing with him, as Brandon Aiyuk had only averaged 4.24 fantasy points per game throughout that span of time. 7 games, only 4.2 fantasy points per game. He was on the free agent wire quickly enough. Throughout that time, he was the number 91 overall wide receiver. But as soon as we got to week 9, everything changed. From weeks 9 through 18, Brandon Aiyuk averaged 11.26 fantasy points per game through those 10 games. He was the number 13 overall wide receiver and the number 18 overall wide receiver in terms of fantasy points per game with 5 games played minimum. In 10 consecutive games, he was able to play 90% of the offensive snaps or more, which he was not able to do from weeks 1 through 8 of that season. He elevated in terms of the amount he played, the opportunities grew, and the fantasy point production got to an extremely consistent level in terms of being a wide receiver too, in his offense and in fantasy football. Now, I know that my praise and what I'm saying right now may not convince you, but just hear it from the horse's mouth. The 2 people that we want to hear all the hype coming from should be Kyle Shanahan and Trey Lance. And all I've seen this offseason is Kyle Shanahan saying that Brandon Aiyuk has done the right things. He's gone about this offseason as an absolute professional going into his 3rd year. He's doing everything the right way and he's dominating. Same thing from Trey Lance. I mean, that has been the guy that in every social media post I have seen on Twitter in the last 15 days via training camp, it has been Trey Lance throwing to Brandon Aiyuk for major plays, whether it's down the field 30 yards or in the red zone. Those 2 are pairing up. Now, I may be getting, fooled by the social media team just because they're trying to build hype, but there's only so many plays a wide receiver should be making at practice, and I swear that Brandon Aiyuk is literally making every single one of them. Now, like I mentioned, you may be a little bit hesitant on drafting Brandon Aiyuk, but understand there's a difference between playing safe and playing smart. I understand some of you might want to play safe because you don't want to, reinvest in a player that burnt you in the past. I think that's just playing scared. In my opinion, one season to another, we're talking about completely different scenarios, different variables. The quarterback's different. The offensive coordinator is different. We have a completely different offense here, and we should take everything into consideration when we're looking at Brandon Aiyuk rather than what he just, inflicted upon us from weeks 1 through 8 of the 2021 year. Either way, I'm excited about his potential. I'm targeting him in my upcoming drafts. You should be doing so as well. that is today's video talking about my mid-round draft targets for the 2022 fantasy football season. I want to thank you guys for watching. Again, if you're trying to get my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings all of August, be sure to sign up via Underdog Fantasy when you go ahead and travel to Underdog Fantasy via the link down in the description of the video and use promo code Andrew today. Not only will you get a deposit match, first time deposit match up to $100, but you'll also get a personal email from me, which includes my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings, which will be sent to you updated weekly for the entire month of August, so that regardless of when you're drafting, you're prepared to help yourself win a 2022 fantasy football championship. All right, again, thank you for watching. Be sure to subscribe, and until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.